Ladies and gentlemen, Blood Meridian. As some of you may know, I'm currently doing a 30-day no social media challenge where I'm using a flip phone instead of my iPhone, and as part of the challenge, I decided to do a little bit of reading instead of looking at my phone. And this is the work that I started with. And I know it's not the normal kind of content that I post, but I really wanted to talk about this book. I actually bought this book years ago because I remember watching a video about something like the top 10 books that have never been made into movies, and this was the one that stuck out to me the most. And let me tell you, this is the most interesting book that I have ever read. And as of right now, I think it's my favorite book. Written by Cormac McCarthy, the writer of No Country for Old Men and The Road and All the Pretty Horses, among other things, but this work is considered his masterpiece. If you're not already familiar with the story, the basic rundown is this. It revolves around the journey of the main character, simply called the Kid. He's a young boy who's essentially a drifter that lives in the Old West, and is eventually recruited by a group of murderers and thieves called the Glanton Gang, led by John Joel Glanton, who roam around the southern United States and Mexico as scalp hunters, hunting down and killing groups of Native Americans for money. Now that's the gist of the plot, really. That's what basically takes place throughout most of the book. But that's not really what the book is all about. This book is not supposed to be like a creative, fictional account of the things that took place in the old United States. This book is a lot more, and a lot more terrifying than that. This book is about the depravity that mankind is capable of, and I would say that it's about good and evil, but it's kind of not. It's mostly just about evil. And I can basically guarantee you that this book is probably not like almost any other book that you've ever read for a handful of reasons. One is its gruesomeness. The depictions of violence that McCarthy describes are wild and brutal, and it's straight up a bloodbath from beginning to end. Like, so much so that if it were turned into a movie, it would have to be turned down like 5 notches just so that it could be shown in movie theaters. Two is contrastly, the absolutely beautiful writing about the character's physical environment. The beauty of humanity is not really featured at all throughout the story, however, the beauty of Mother Nature is. The gorgeousness of the landscapes and the scenery that are involved are constantly given amazingly detailed and incredible descriptions that paint like a tremendous visual pictures that the nasty and vicious characters inhabit. And the third thing that I think distinguishes this book from other books is about its character development. More specifically, the relationship between the actual information that you're given about the characters and everything that the story tells you about what the characters actually do. The one exception is possibly the judge, but he is kind of a different story, so we'll have to get to him later. And it's actually so funny because none of the characters are given like detailed accounts of their origins or backstories. The most information that you'll get about any of these people is maybe like where they came from and a description of what they look like. And even that is never given more than just a few lines. You really don't even know how most of these guys even got here. They just are. Also, throughout the entire book, very little portions are devoted to explaining what the characters are even thinking or feeling about what is happening at any given moment. And I think this is why some people have a difficult time reading this book, because most people probably expect those kinds of things from a story, and it's particularly funny because all of that especially goes for the main character, the Kid. I mean, we literally don't even know his name. And throughout the story, he almost never even speaks. Like, most of the things that he does don't have an actual effect on the people around him, or his environment, or even his fate, for that matter. But that's not what this book is about, really. And I believe it was the intention of the writer to make the main character as sort of like a blank slate, someone with no purpose, with no real understanding of himself or the world. Of course, the Kid is only 14 or 15 at the beginning of the story anyway, but as far as I can best understand, one of the main designs of the story is about the idea of a person, particularly with no purpose, dealing with and encountering the most malevolent aspects of human nature. He's like a leaf that's floating in the ocean, and this ocean is made up of a Mother Nature that is borderline inhospitable, and a group of men that are ruthless killers and cause complete destruction wherever they step foot. So the details of the story start like this. Beginning in the year 1849, as is said in the book, shortly before the American Civil War, in where we would later find out as Tennessee, the birthplace of the Kid. And it's not actually explained in the book, but I kind of get the impression that he may have never even been given a name, and if he was, he might no longer even know it. Like, no one ever asks him his name, and he never introduces himself with one. He's only referred to as the kid. His origins are given a very basic explanation, saying that his mother died while giving birth to him, and his father basically never had any interest in him. He is extremely poor. He has absolutely nothing, just the rags that he's given as clothes. The only description ever given of his character takes place right on the first page and says this: "He watches, pale and unwashed. He can neither read nor write, and in him broods already a taste for mindless violence." And the term mindless violence characterizes most of what takes place in this book. This book is straight up violent and apocalyptic. People fight and murder each other non-stop throughout the entire story. At 14, the kid runs away from his home and drifts around the southern United States and Mexico border. He finds work with whoever he comes across in exchange for food and sometimes a place to stay. Eventually, the kid makes his way through an area called the Latter-day Republic of Fredonia into a town called Nacogdoches. And there, we are introduced to the judge. Now, of course, there are a lot of characters that feature in this book, but the kid and the judge are the only two real main characters. And while the entire story revolves around the kid and follows everything that he does, it could be argued that the actual main character of the book is really the judge himself. And no matter what you think about this book, I guarantee you that you will never read something else with a character exactly like the judge. He is described as a hugely enormous man, nearly 7 feet tall, weighing 350 pounds. He is bald as a stone. He has no eyebrows and no eyelashes. In fact, there's not a single hair on his entire body. Later on, we learn a lot about the judge, more so than any other person in the book, in fact. He has been all over the world, apparently. He knows every single language of any person that he comes across. He speaks English, Spanish, French, Dutch, German, and God knows what else. Apparently, as the members of the gang will later testify to, the judge is capable of doing any task that is necessary of him. He can play the fiddle better than any has ever heard. He can dance with impossible rhythmic precision, and without going into it any further right now, he is the most depraved and sadistic entity that the world has ever known. When the kid enters the town of Nacogdoches, he walks into a large canvas tent where most of the townspeople are listening to a reverend speak with the Bible, and this is where we are first introduced to the judge. Without anyone knowing who the judge is, he walks into the tent, and everyone immediately goes silent and watches him. He walks up to the front and stands in front of the reverend and says this: "Ladies and gentlemen, I feel it my duty to inform you that the man holding this revival is an impostor. He holds no papers of divinity from any institution recognized or improvised. He is altogether devoid of the least qualification to the office he has usurped, and has only committed to memory a few passages from the good book for the purpose of lending to his fraudulent sermons some faint flavor of the piety he despises. In truth, the gentleman standing here before you, posing as a minister of the Lord, is not only totally illiterate, but is also wanted by the law in the states of Tennessee, Kentucky, Mississippi, and Arkansas, on a variety of charges, the most recent of which involved a girl of 11 years, I said 11, who came to him in trust, and whom he was surprised in the act of violating while actually clothed in the livery of his God. Not 3 weeks before this, he was run out of Fort Smith, Arkansas for having Congress with a goat. After the judge says all of this, he leaves immediately. The people of the town, however, are completely enraged, and a huge fight breaks out. Everyone who has a pistol in their possession starts shooting at the reverend and at each other. The tent completely collapses from the fighting and the gunfire, and it's not revealed exactly, but it's implied that most people die. And then, just a few moments later, some of the men that were in the tent go to the bar where the judge is standing alone, patiently. They ask him when he was in Fort Smith, and how he found out all these things about the reverend. And the judge simply says that he'd never been to Fort Smith, Arkansas in his entire life, and he'd never seen the reverend, nor had he ever even heard of him before the moment that he walked into that tent himself. And that is our sole introduction to the judge for now. The judge literally just made all of it up on the spot. His only intentions were to cause chaos and destruction, and for people to die. As far as the kid goes, he has not been introduced to the Glanton gang just yet. He continues drifting until he is recruited by a group of mercenaries that were once American soldiers in the Mexican-American War, and although the war had ended, they wanted to continue the war on their own terms, and try to conquer as much Mexican land as they could to either keep it for themselves or expand it as part of America. Now, the kid's stint with this group is very short-lived. where on their first expedition, they accomplish absolutely nothing. And within only a week or two of them setting out to fight the Mexicans and conquer new territory, they encounter a group of savages in the middle of the barren Mexican desert. A group of people that they could have absolutely never prepared for. When they first see them in the distance, they think they're just a group of unassuming travelers, but they were wrong. And this is the instance in the book where absolute bloody mayhem and insanity makes its first of many appearances. The group that they encounter, and the slaughter that takes place, is described from the company's perspective as follows. Already you could see through the dust on the ponies' hides, the painted chevrons and the hands and the rising suns and birds, and fish of every device, like the shade of old work through sizing on a canvas. Now too you could hear above the pounding of the unshod hooves the piping of the quena, flutes made from human bones, and some among the company had begun to saw back on their mounts, and some to mill in confusion, when up from the offside of those ponies there rose a fabled horde of mounted lancers and archers, bearing shields bedight with bits of broken mirror glass that cast 1,000 unpieced suns against the eyes of their enemies. A legion of horribles, hundreds in number, half-naked or clad in costumes, Attic or biblical, or wardrobed out of a fevered dream, with the skins of animals and silk finery, and pieces of uniform still tracked with the blood of their prior owners. Coats of slain dragoons, frogged and braided cavalry jackets, one in a stovepipe hat, and one with an umbrella, and one in white stockings and a blood-stained wedding veil, and some in headgear of crane feathers or rawhide helmets that bore the horns of bull or buffalo, and one in a pigeon-tailed coat worn backwards, and otherwise naked, and one in the armor of a Spanish conquistador, the breastplate and cauldrons deeply dented with old blows of mace or saber done in another country by men whose very bones were dust, and many with their braids spliced up with the hair of other beasts, until they trailed upon the ground, and their horses' ears and tails worked with bits of brightly colored cloth, and one whose horse's whole head was painted crimson red, and all of the horsemen's faces gaudy and grotesque, with daubings like a company of mounted clowns, death hilarious, all howling in a barbarous tongue, and riding down upon them like a horde from a hell more horrible yet than the brimstone land of Christian reckoning, screeching and yammering, and clothed in smoke, like those vaporous beings in regions beyond right knowing, where the eye wanders and the lip trembles and drools. A rattling drove of arrows passed through the company, and men tottered and dropped from their mounts. Horses were rearing and plunging, and the Mongol hordes swung up along their flanks, and turned and rode full upon them with lances. The company was now come to a halt, and the first shots were fired, and the gray rifle smoke rolled through the dust as the lancers breached their ranks. The kid's horse sank beneath him with a long pneumatic sigh. He had already fired his rifle, and now he sat on the ground and fumbled with his shot pouch. A man near him sat with an arrow hanging out of his neck. He was bent slightly as if in prayer. The kid would have reached for the bloody hoop-iron point, but then he saw the man wore another arrow in his breast to the fletching, and was dead. Everywhere there were horses down and men scrambling, and he saw a man who sat charging his rifle while blood ran from his ears, and he saw men kneeling who tilted and clasped their shadows on the ground, and he saw men lanced and caught up by the hair, scalped standing, and he saw the horses of war trample down the fallen, and a little white-faced pony with one clouded eye leaned out of the murk and snapped at him like a dog and was gone. Among the wounded, some seemed dumb and without understanding, and some were pale through the masks of dust, and some had fouled themselves or tottered brokenly onto the spears of the savages. Now, driving in a wild frenzy of headlong horses with eyes walled and teeth cropped, and naked riders with clusters of arrows clenched in their jaws, and their shields winking in the dust, and up the far side of their ruined ranks in a piping of bone flutes, and dropping down off the sides of their mounts, with one heel hung in the wither's strap, and their short bows flexing beneath the outstretched ranks of the ponies until they had circled the company, and cut their ranks in two, and then, rising up again like funhouse figures, some with nightmare faces painted on their breasts, riding down the unhorsed Saxons, and spearing and clubbing them, and leaping from their mounts with knives, and running about on the ground with a peculiar bandy-legged trot, like creatures deaconed to alien forms of locomotion, and stripping the clothes from the dead, and seizing them up by the hair, and passing their blades about the skulls of the living and the dead alike, and snatching aloft the bloody wigs, and hacking and chopping at the naked bodies, ripping off limbs, heads, gutting the strange white torsos, holding up great handfuls of viscera, genitals, some of the savages so slathered up with gore they might have rolled in it like dogs, and some fell upon the dying and sodomized them with loud cries to their fellows. And now the horses of the dead came pounding out of the smoke and dust, and circled with flapping leather, and wild manes, and eyes whited with fear, like the eyes of the blind, and some were feathered with arrows, and some lanced through, and stumbling, and vomiting blood, as they wheeled across the killing ground, and clattered from sight again. Dust stanched the wet and naked heads of the scalped, who with the fringe of their hair below their wounds, and tonsured to the bone, now lay like pained and naked monks in the blood-slaked dust, and everywhere the dying groaned and gibbered, and horses lay screaming. So their company started out with maybe 40 or 50 men, and only about 6 survived, one of them being the kid. He wanders through the desert on foot for days, and is eventually captured by a group of Mexicans, who take him captive and bring him to the nearest Mexican town. And instead of killing him, they figure he's worth a few bucks, and decide to sell him to none other than the Glanton gang, who arrive shortly after. The gang rides into town and are described as follows. They saw a pack of vicious-looking humans, mounted on unshod Indian ponies, riding half-drunk through the streets, bearded, barbarous, clad in the skins of animals stitched up with thews, and armed with weapons of every description, revolvers of enormous weight, and bowie knives the size of claymores, and short two-barreled rifles, with bores you could stick your thumbs in, and the trappings of their horses fashioned out of human skin, and their bridles woven up from human hair and decorated with human teeth, and the riders wearing scapulars or necklaces of dried and blackened human ears, and the horses raw-looking and wild in the eye, and their teeth bared like feral dogs, and riding among the company a number of half-naked savages reeling in the saddle, dangerous, filthy, brutal, the whole like a visitation from some heathen land where they, and others like them, fed on human flesh. Now, the origin of the gang is never explained exactly, but all we really know about them is that they're a bunch of heathens, and their leader is John Joel Glanton. But the second in command, so to speak, is the judge, who really has the biggest influence on the outcome of all the events that take place. And at first it was kind of funny to me that the leader of the gang wouldn't be the judge himself, because he's really the main character, and Glanton is secondary to him in terms of the storyline and everything else, but he is in control of the gang officially. But anyway, from here on out, we follow the gang and everything that they do, which is mostly killing people. Like, I'm not going to go into every single instance of violence, because that would be like the rest of the book, basically, but to illustrate how meaningless human life is to these guys. There was one instance where Glanton wanted to purchase a new pistol, and as he has it in his hands, he goes up to an old woman that's standing in the street, and just to test how well it shoots, he shoots her right in the middle of the head, just to see basically how much damage it'll do. And then there are like these other random moments where Glanton finds a starving dog in a hut, and he decides to give it some food because he wanted to own it. And for the rest of the story, this dog just follows him everywhere they go. And Glanton likes it because it's like his little assistant, I guess. And I don't think he values it because it's like a living being, more so because he can have it as like property. And you don't know why exactly, but you just know that it's not out of like some sense of humanity or anything like that. Like, there's this one scene where they go into this village of people and just ruthlessly murder all of them. Just for their scalps, of course, like literally 150 people, children and everything. And after they're done, they're just walking around the mounds of bodies that they just created and cutting off their scalps for money. And all of a sudden, Glanton just goes, "Hey, has anyone seen my dog?" And then there's this other kind of funny moment where they're riding through the mountains in the fall time, and a leaf falls off of a tree onto Glanton's horse. And the book says, Glanton picked the leaf up and twindled it by its stem before letting it fall back to the ground, and its beauty was not lost on him. So, make of that what you will, I guess. But yeah, I'm not going to go over the rest of the entire series of events in the book, but the thing that has to be talked about the most is the judge. And I'm not going to spoil the ending or anything like that, but I am going to talk about what the judge is and how he's basically the crux of the world that the story takes place in. So if you haven't read the book and you want to see what it's all about before you actually hear about it, then you should do that before you listen to this. So there you go. Okay, so McCarthy revealed that his inspiration for the judge was literally Satan himself. More specifically, Satan from Milton's Paradise Lost, which is one of the greatest pieces of classical literature of all time, like right up there with Dante's Inferno and Homer's Iliad, none of which I have actually read at this point, but I plan on it in the future. And the judge in Blood Meridian isn't just like a really bad guy. I believe it is pretty much unanimously agreed upon that although he might not literally be the embodiment of the actual devil, he is also not entirely human. It may be that inside whatever spiritual or supernatural reality that exists within the universe that the book is written in, the judge is so close to the evil side that it provides him with not only a lack of mortality, but with all of the abilities that he has, like knowing every single language and having this weird scientific understanding of the properties of the earth. I don't know. That's just a possible theory. And it's also not specifically written in the book, but we know that nobody ever sees him eating or sleeping. And not only does he not die, sorry, spoiler alert, not really actually, but at no point in the book does he ever even become injured by any of the fighting that takes place, whereas literally every single other character that features in the book does die or get seriously injured at some point. But we are given insights into the judge that we're not given about any other character. We do know that how he views himself and the world is literally the polar opposite of how a person would view everything if they believed in a benevolent god. Like throughout the book, as the gang is traveling from place to place through the mountains and the wilderness, the judge is constantly searching for physical evidence of civilizations that have lived there in the past and bones of animals that have gone extinct. And he has this little notebook that he takes these things and makes perfectly accurate little sketches of. And when asked why he does this, his answer was because anything that exists without his knowledge exists without his consent. And that, for example, when he sees birds that fly through the sky, the freedom that they have is an insult to him. And he would rather have every single animal locked up in cages in a zoo, apparently so that he could have ultimate control over living existence. And, who might have that kind of point of view? A twisted fella. That's who. Or more specifically, who would want to have ultimate control over all of living existence? The devil would. Yeah. Throughout the book, the judge makes monologues about his systems of belief and how the world works to the gang, most of whom are basically illiterate. But the judge is such a mystifying character that the gang and the reader are constantly trying to figure out what the judge thinks. And his most infamous speech is about war, and it goes like this. The judge cracked with the back of an axe the shin bone on an antelope, and the hot marrow dripped smoking on the stones. They watched him. The subject was war. The good book says that he that lives by the sword shall perish by the sword, said Black Jackson. The judge smiled, his face shining with grace. What right man would have it any other way, he said. The good book does indeed count war as an evil thing, said Irving, yet there's many a bloody tale of war inside it. It makes no difference what men think of war, said the judge. War endures. As well, ask men what they think of stone. War was always here. Before man was, war waited for him, the ultimate trade awaiting its ultimate practitioner. That is the way it was and will be, that way, and not some other way. All other trades are contained in that of war. Is that why war endures? One asked. No, it endures because young men love it, and old men love it in them. Those that fought, those that did not. That's your notion. The judge smiled. Men are born for games, nothing else. Every child knows that play is nobler than work. He knows, too, that the worth or merit of a game is not inherent in the game itself, but rather in the value of that which is put at hazard. Games of chance require a wager to have meaning at all. Games of sport involve the skill and strength of the opponents, and the humiliation of defeat, and the pride of victory are in themselves sufficient stake, because they inhere in the worth of the principles and define them. But trials of chance, or trial of worth, All games aspire to the condition of war, for here that which is wagered swallows up game, player, all. Suppose two men at cards, with nothing to wager save their lives. Who has not heard such a tale? A turn of the card. The whole universe for such a player has labored, clanking to this moment, which will tell if he is to die at that man's hand, or that man at his. What more certain validation of a man's worth could there be? This enhancement of the game to its ultimate state admits no argument concerning the notion of fate. The selection of one man over another is a preference absolute and irrevocable, and it is a dull man indeed who could reckon so profound a decision without agency or significance, either one. In games as have for their stake the annihilation of the defeated, the decisions are quite clear. This man holding this particular arrangement of cards in his hand is thereby removed from existence. This is the nature of war, whose stake is at once the game, and the authority, and the justification. Seen so, war is the truest form of divination. It is the testing of one's will, and the will of another within that larger will, which because it binds them, is therefore forced to select. What joins men together is not the sharing of bread, but the sharing of enemies. War is the ultimate game, because war is at last a forcing of the unity of existence. War is God. So the judge is the ultimate bad guy, and the only thing that he truly values is exerting his power over the world. And the ultimate form of doing that is killing people, which he is very successful in doing. And some people might struggle after reading this book, if you can even make it all the way through, which a lot of people can't. Because there really isn't any typical features of a storyline that involves a villain like the judge. None of the characters are motivated by any intentions that you can relate with. Like, there's no real source of revenge or redemption or self-improvement for any reason for any of the people involved at any point. But foremost, although there is a seriously powerful antagonist, there's really no protagonist. There's no good guy. And I'm not exaggerating at all when I say that nothing good happens throughout this entire story. So when you're taking the entire plot into account, you have to remove those kinds of expectations, basically, to try to find the real meaning of it all. So what are we even supposed to make of that? Well, all we really have is the kid, but he's not necessarily a good guy, right? He certainly doesn't act as like the prototypical hero. And you would have to put in a lot of effort if you were going to really try to emotionally sympathize with him, really. I mean, if he did all the things that he did in today's world, he would be prosecuted for crimes against humanity. And even though he might not have initiated any of the events that took place, he was certainly implicit in all of them. The most that you can say about him is that he is the least evil out of all of the characters, which I think is totally fair to say. I mean, yeah, he joined a gang that murder people for money, but he was enslaved at the time, and if he didn't join them, then he probably would have been executed himself. If you were to try to make the best case for him that you could say that he didn't have much of a choice, really. He came into the world with absolutely nothing, and everything that he does because he's just trying to survive himself. And after all, he was only 14 when he got picked up by the gang. You know, how was he supposed to know better? Which is fair, I suppose. And again, it's kind of hard to figure out what to make of it, because, like I said, the kid's thoughts and the reasons behind his decision-making are never revealed by the writer. He's just there, being a subject to his environment the whole time. But we are given a handful of instances where the kid is forced to make a decision, most of the time because he has no other real choice. There's one time where he's left behind by the gang because they were short on horses, and his job was to stay behind with the other member of the gang and to put him down because he was injured and couldn't be of use to Glanton or the judge. And instead, he chooses to give the guy some water, and he tries to bring him along with him instead of killing him, even though he has no reason for doing so. You know, he couldn't provide anything to the kid, but he still refused to kill him. So yeah, one of the most positive instances of the story is when a person simply does not die. And then there's this other time where the kid finds a Bible, and although he's completely illiterate, he can't read or write, he chooses to take it with him because we can only assume he feels like he should have it as the form of something that's possibly good. And at the end of the book, there's no resolve. There's no real change in any direction that the reader would like to see in the world that this book takes place in. So you have to come to the conclusion that that's not what it's all about. Like, you know that one quote that says, "The only thing necessary for the triumph of evil is that good men do nothing"? Well, I think that was supposed to be for the kid. Although, yes, the world failed him in a way, because he had to fight for his life at every single moment, and no one helped him in any way that would allow him to live a respectable existence. But he never ends up truly deciding to do good things. All the other characters are dead as a direct result of the violence that they chose to engage in. And although he lives, he doesn't end up rising to the occasion. And the world goes on paying the price for it. And the triumph of evil is in greater effect than ever in the form of the judge. And okay, you know what? I am going to talk about what happens at the end of the book. So if you don't want to know yet, then stop watching. Although this book is meant to be read multiple times, so you can know what ends up happening, and it's not going to necessarily ruin the entire context of the book or anything, but it's up to you. So what happens is the entire gang commandeers a ferry and are camped out on a river for weeks in California around the San Diego area. Eventually, they all end up getting murdered by a group of Indians called the Yumas. Everyone except the kid, the judge, and a couple of other people. The judge tries to murder the kid after the fact and hunts him down for 5 days through the desert. But the kid is able to make his way to San Diego and basically escape the situation entirely. And those couple of other people from the gang that lived end up getting arrested by the police in San Diego and hanged. So literally only the two survived. Then 30 years goes by, and the kid, now referred to as the man, is essentially a drifter still. Again, the characters are never talked about in terms of their development or their thought process or anything like that, but you can basically infer that nothing has changed in his life. He is still just a human that simply exists, nothing more. Yes, his days of killing people for money have long gone, but he has failed to find any kind of purpose or substance in his life. He has a horse, a pair of boots, and all the clothes that he can fit on his body, but he does not have any meaning, if there was ever any meaning to be found in the world that he inhabits. And then there's another one of these oddly, kind of positive moments where the kid is camped out somewhere near Mexico in the mountains at night, and he comes across this really old woman who is kneeling down, almost as if in prayer, all by herself. He sees that something's not right and that she needs help, so he kneels down beside her and starts talking to her. He asks her what she's doing, but she doesn't answer. And then he offers her his help. He says that he has a horse and he can bring her back to town and she can live out the rest of her life in peace. And then he goes to touch her and he realizes that she's dead. And she's been dead for years and years. She's almost dust at this point. So that's the kindest interaction that takes place between any two people in this entire book. And it's like this moment where the man actually goes out of his way to do something good. But now he's older, and not only is it all in vain, it's altogether too late. So then the final event takes place, and it's a little bit weird. He finds his way to a town, like he's done 1,000 times before, and steps into the first bar that he finds so that he can get drunk. And when he's sitting down at the bar, he sees through the mirror behind the bar the judge sitting at the table behind him, who had not aged a day over all this time. The kid looks away because some Mexicans at the bar kill a full-grown bear that was dancing and playing music for everyone's entertainment, and when he looks back, the judge is standing over him smiling, as he almost always was. And at no point in the story does the judge actually show any emotion other than being totally pleased with himself and his environment. The judge says a bunch of things, some of which are up for interpretation. "Was it always your idea," he said, "that if you did not speak, you would not be recognized? I recognized you when I first saw you, and yet you were a disappointment to me, then and now. Even so, at the last, I find you here with me." The kid tries to ignore him, and he doesn't give the judge much in the form of an answer. But the judge goes on, seemingly like testing the man, seeing if over all these years he has learned the meaning of anything. most notably about dance, which he seems to use as some kind of metaphor for the value of a man's existence. I'm going to skip around here a bit, but he goes on saying this. "You're here for the dance," said the judge. The kid says he has to go, and the judge was aggrieved by this. "Go?" he said. "What man would not be a dancer if he could? It's a great thing, the dance." This is the orchestration for an event. For a dance, in fact. The participants will be apprised of their roles at the proper time. For now, it is enough that they have arrived. As the dance is the thing with which we are concerned, and contains complete within itself its own arrangement and history and finale, there is no necessity that the dancers contain these things within themselves as well. Here, every man knows the false at once. Never doubt it. That feeling in the breast that evokes a child's memory of loneliness, such as when the others have gone, and only the game is left with its solitary participant. You, of all men, are no stranger to that feeling, the emptiness and the despair. The man doesn't seem to care to give his thoughts on the subject matter, and again seemingly ignores the judge. But the judge goes on. "A man seeks his own destiny, and no other," said the judge. "Will or nil. Any man who could discover his own fate, and elect therefore some opposite course, could only come at last to that self-same reckoning, at the same appointed time, for each man's destiny is as large as the world he inhabits, and contains within it all opposites as well. Drink up," he said. "The world goes on. We have dancing nightly, and this night is no exception. I tell you this, as war becomes dishonored, and its nobility called into question, those honorable men who recognize the sanctity of blood will become excluded from the dance, which is the warrior's right, and thereby will the dance become a false dance, and the dancers false dancers. And yet there will be one there, always, who is a true dancer, and can you guess who that might be?" The man says, "You ain't nothin'." The judge says, "You speak truer than you know, but I will tell you, only that man who has offered up himself entire to the blood of war, who has been to the floor of the pit, and seen horror in the round, and learned at last that it speaks to his innermost heart, only that man can dance." And after this conversation, of sorts, I guess, the man leaves and wanders about the establishment a little bit, and he goes and sleeps with a prostitute, okay? And after that, at the end of the night, as he's making his way out, he passes by the dance floor, where a big ring of people were dancing in a circle, and he disregards it and decides to leave. The book says this. "He went down the walkboards towards the jakes," which means the outhouses. "He stood outside listening to the voices fading away, and he looked again at the silent tracks of the stars where they died over the darkened hills. Then he opened the rough board door and stepped in. The judge was seated upon the closet. He was naked, and he rose up smiling, and gathered him in his arms against his immense and terrible flesh, and shot the wooden bar latch home behind him. A little while later, 2 other men go out to use the outhouses themselves. In the mudded dog yard behind the premises, 2 men went down the boards towards the jakes. A 3rd man was standing there, urinating in the mud. 'Is someone in there?' said the first man. The man who was relieving himself did not look up. 'I wouldn't go in there if I was you,' he said. 'Is somebody in there?' 'I wouldn't go in.' The first man watched him go, and then opened the door to the jakes. 'Good God Almighty,' he said. 'What is it?' He didn't answer. And in the very last scene of the book, the very last thing that is written about is of the judge. He is completely naked, and is dancing insanely, and playing the fiddle among the crowd of people as they watch him in astonishment. And he says that he never sleeps, and he will never die. He dances in light and in shadow, and he is a great favorite among the crowd. And he says that he never sleeps, and he will never die.